Our next speaker is Victor Franco, and he will present on the issue of prayers in local government meetings. Victor is a councillor at the city of Boroondara, in Melbourne's eastern suburbs. After a 3-year campaign to have prayers removed from council, in October this year, Victor finally succeeded when Boroondara Council voted to remove prayer after receiving a letter from lawyers acting on Victor's behalf. So not conviction then.
Thank you, everyone. It's been 5 weeks since the success in the campaign of removing prayer from our governance rules and ending the practice of starting with an official Christian prayer. So I'm still very pleased about that. It was a long battle. We no longer engage in prayer at Boroondara, but with so many councils across Australia still praying, there's a lot of work to do. So look, I'll just touch in this presentation about prayer in local government, how it works, how we can get rid of it, drawing on my experiences at the city of Boroondara. First, I'll just say, why is it important to remove prayer from local government? I don't really need to say it to this audience. But look, it's the only way we can be genuinely inclusive, and it's a hallmark of good governance. It means everyone can participate in the entirety of council meetings without having to participate in the religious rituals of one specific group. And it means we can focus on what we're elected to do. I'm not religious. I was raised without religion. My partner was raised without religion. We raise our children without religion. Despite this, after being elected, I was made to take part in an official Christian prayer at the opening of each and every council meeting at Boroondara. I took part, this is genuine, I took part in more religious rituals as a councillor than I have anywhere else in my entire life. It's quite extraordinary. And look, like most councillors, I didn't stand for council to advance the glory of God. That's what our former prayer, I can say now, our former prayer asked us to do. It's not the role of elected councillors, and nor should it be. Our councils aren't, our local councils aren't local churches, and we shouldn't try to convert them into local churches. So prayer in local government, it's quite a unusual space. About 1/3 of councils in Australia, it's estimated, commence their meetings with a prayer. But there are over 500 councils in Australia, and circumstances are always changing, and maintaining up-to-date figures and knowing exactly what's going on across the country is very difficult to do. It's very challenging. I did have a slide, courtesy of Luke Beck. Oh, thank you. And thank you, Luke, because I took this from if he's still here, I'm sure he is. I took it from one of Luke's papers. This gives you a bit of a feel for the situation. And these figures are a few years old. And obviously my council isn't counted in this, but it shows that New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland are the places where the practice is most widespread. And it's very hard to know if your council prays. The only way you can really be certain is to actually watch the start of a council meeting or get perhaps the meeting procedures for that meeting. Those councils that pray may or may not prescribe the prayer in any particularly any approved policy or document. At Boroondara, for example, we contained them in the governance rules for a few years, and a few years before that we had it in a councillor code of conduct. Some councils put it in their meeting procedures, some don't, some just pray. So it's actually, the only way you'll be certain is by actually looking at the start of a council meeting and actually seeing what they're doing. And sometimes you may not realise, is it a council meeting, a committee meeting, where it's starting, but it's usually the official council meetings where the practice happens. So how does prayer work in local government? As I say, it varies, but there's usually one constant, and that constant is that it's usually, almost always, an exclusively Christian prayer. Over 90% of councils have been estimated to have an exclusively Christian prayer. There are a few councils that have multi-faith practices. I'm not very familiar with them, or rotating practices. Some councils invite external guests to lead the prayer, such as religious leaders. But the most typical process is the one that took place at my council, and that's where the mayor, after opening the meeting, will then ask councillors to stand for the prayer and lead the council in prayer, or call on a colleague councillor to lead that council, to lead the council in prayer. Not surprisingly, I was never asked to lead the prayer. And where did the practice in local government start? It's not quite the same situation as with federal or state parliaments. There's no tradition dating back to colonial times. By and large, the practice came to prominence, at least in Victoria and New South Wales, in the middle of the last century. In 1948, in Victoria, the Municipal Association, after some lobbying from councillors involved in the association, decided to take it on as a campaign, and they got councils from across Victoria to consider the practice and vote on it. And so there was widespread discussion in the late 40s, and again in the early 50s there was another push, and similar campaign took place in New South Wales. And what's often overlooked is that there was controversy then. Not all councils just immediately jumped on board, and not all councillors jumped on board, despite the religious affiliation of the country at the time. It wasn't so straightforward. Many councils still didn't take it on, and many councils that did take it on objected, and publicly objected. So what happened at my council, and how did I succeed in removing the prayer? After my council it was established, Burundara, in the mid-90s, at a time where over 70% of Australians identified as Christian, and they adopted a Christian prayer as a practice to open meetings. I haven't read as to any controversy at the time, that just commenced. So after I got elected, I was very uncomfortable, and I thought, well, look, I'll start with a polite and conciliatory approach as the best way to tackle the issue with my new colleagues. I made clear my concerns and my discomfort with the practice in many internal discussions. And in the meantime, and despite the unease it caused me, and with great reluctance, I opted to stand for the prayer, knowing that we would very soon be reviewing it in our governance rules. And just understand how uncomfortable I was doing that. But anyway, when we issued our draft governance rules for public comment, the report from council officers, and this was back in 2021, to my dismay, recommended including the prayer. And 9 of my fellow councillors voted in support of that, and 2 of us, myself and one other, a person of faith, voted against. Now, that meant our governance rules went out for public comment, and I knew that an 88-page document setting out our meeting procedures is not something that members of the public read and write submissions on in their spare time. So I went out of my way to alert the community and the media and everyone I could tell as to what was going on, that there were prayer provisions in the governance rules, and that we were praying at the start of each council meeting. In response to that, 8 of my fellow councillors lodged a formal application under the Burundara Councillor Code of Conduct, alleging misconduct for my media conducts, in which I spoke out against the prayer. I've always considered these allegations of misconduct, which have still not been withdrawn, they're still hanging there, to be vexatious. The community, by contrast, responded in large numbers, overwhelmingly calling for the removal of the practice and its replacement with something more inclusive, or it's simply, by and large, they wanted it removed. Now, such community support in my municipality isn't surprising. In the 2021 results, where I'm based, 47% of my community identified as not religious. That's close to half. And about 40% identified as Christian, the remaining 10% other religions and other views. Now, despite that community outcry, my colleagues still voted again, same 9 votes in favour of the prayer, 2 against. That didn't motivate them. So I then decided to take a couple of further steps. Firstly, I responded by refusing to stand for the prayer. I gave some thought as to, should I try and stand out of the room? In local government, it's hard. You don't have the time that you have in federal state parliament to jump in and out. So I thought, look, I'll sit. And it ended up resulting in a somewhat comical commencement to council meetings. Everyone present except me stood for the prayer. Then we moved to the acknowledgement. I stood up and half a dozen other councillors sat down. So after that happened, the first meeting, that continued to happen every meeting after that. But the mayor then decided to say, well, you can stand for the prayer if you want to. So that was a new admission, I suppose, or a small change. I also joined with 20 other councillors from across Victoria in writing an open letter to the state government, the Equal Opportunity Human Rights Commission, the Municipal Association of Victoria and other bodies opposing the practice of including religious worship in council meetings and urging them to protect freedom from religion. Both of these measures, the sitting down, the open letter, generated more public attention and criticism of the practice, but they didn't change the situation materially. It was the potential unlawful nature of the prayer that eventually led to its downfall and the legal challenge. And so being left with no option, with the support of Professor Luke Beck from Monash University, who spoke earlier, and I have great praise for Luke and the support he gave me, I sought legal advice and support from law firm Morris Blackburn. In January 2023, my lawyers sent council a letter of demand, and this is what changed everything. The letter advised that the prayer, firstly, was in breach of the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, and secondly, that it was ultra vires, that it went beyond the powers of local councils and was not authorised by the Victorian Local Government Act. And, to make it stronger, the letter of demand, and this is important, came with a draft statement of claim attached, demonstrating I was ready and willing to commence court proceedings if my fellow colleagues didn't back down. So, in response, a month later, the following month in February, Burundara Council temporarily stopped praying at council meetings and resolved to consult again on the removal of the prayer with the public. Hundreds of submissions were received, again, 86% of which call for the removal of the prayer. And in October, 5 weeks ago, as I say, Burundara Council resolved, this time it was 10 votes to 1, to remove the prayer from our governance rules, thereby ending the practice altogether. What's interesting to know is that regardless of the community views, and they were very, very clear, it was a very strong message, a number of my colleagues made very clear that they were doing so begrudgingly and because they felt compelled to do so, not because they were listening to the community. That was not the material factor that changed their decision. Look, as a result of their backing down, it meant that the matter didn't proceed to court. Had it have proceeded to court, and if we'd attained a court judgment that it was unlawful, it would have had implications for local government across the board, at least in Victoria. But at least a cloud's been cast over the legality of the practice. Morris Blackburn considered the practice of Burundara to be unlawful, as do the 3 barristers that worked on my case. Professor Luke Beck has published a peer-reviewed academic paper arguing that the practice in local government in Australia is unlawful. And so where do we go from here? I mean, I think the next steps, we need to find councillors willing not only to speak out and vote against the prayer and comment, but potentially willing to consider legally challenging the practice in their municipality. It's hard to find councillors and encourage councillors to speak out, especially if they're in a minority. It's not easy. There are various barriers, and I'll touch very quickly on some of the factors. There are costs associated with obtaining legal advice, costs associated with undertaking potential court proceedings, potential adverse costs of order if the case were to be lost, damaging relationships with fellow councillors, voter backlash that some fear from those in the community that want the prayer retained, although I think Chris Schott has explained that I think we should start ignoring that. And the potential, and this is another one I want to make clear, potentially foregoing the opportunity of being appointed mayor or deputy mayor or similar appointments. I mean, in the case of these positions, they come well remunerated. At Burundara, where I am, the mayor receives an extra 100,000, the deputy mayor receives an extra 50,000. If you have colleagues, I'm not saying this is the case at Burundara, but across the board, and I have spoken to councillors in Victoria who have said they're concerned, you know, they could forego these opportunities and perhaps miss out if they take on an issue that's important to a colleague. Now, going forward, I want to help continue with this campaign. I don't see it as ended until the practice is stopped across the board, across Australia. And I'm going to at least work to reach out to additional councillors and see if we can provide support, potentially develop a broader campaign, Councillors for Secular Government, to continue the campaign and to seek to provide support and assistance for those that might be willing to consider those additional steps and potentially willing to consider legal action. And I think that's the way we can go forward. And if I leave you with one thing, reach out to your local councillor, your ward councillor or councillors, find out if your councillor's praying and find out if there are any councillors that might be willing to take the case further. Thank you.